Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with the next update to the Canadian Federal Election Prediction Series. So, we've had some interesting data points that have happened this week. I'm going to, in another video, probably tomorrow, go into and dissect the results of the Saskatchewan and British Columbia elections because they have interesting corollaries to the federal elections. I did not do the same thing for New Brunswick because the New Brunswick results were not as interesting. You'll see what I mean when I do the video. For this, we also had, federally, we also had two by-elections on Monday. York Centre and Toronto Centre. York Centre was narrowly won. York Centre was narrowly won by the Liberals over the Conservative Canada by about 4 points. I believe it was 46 to 42 with after rounding. And Toronto Centre was won by the Liberals by a bit more margin, but with less total votes at 42 to 33. Both of these results should be pretty shocking to people. Toronto Centre normally goes Liberal well past 50% margin. The last couple elections, Toronto Centre went Liberal over 50%. So this is quite of a shocking result. In York Centre, barring 2011 to 2015, has been a Liberal riding since the 50s. And by fairly heavy margins, at some points up to 70%. So the fact that these two ridings are contestable puts inklings that possibly the polling in Ontario is wrong, or that Liberals have a very big enthusiasm problem and their voters aren't going to the polls. Obviously, that's not something we can really test unless, for some reason, more parliamentarians resign, or we actually have the election. But it does put some questions sitting here on polling results, which I will be keeping an eye into. It is kind of using by-elections is complicated in the model because, the turnout's really low, so it's kind of hard to, I'm not 100% certain how I want to extrapolate that to a full election that has a normal turnout, but so the Toronto by-elections have not been factored into this model explicitly yet, but I'm looking into it. That said, let's go over what has changed here. So PEI flop back down to a less safe margin, so it's 40-50 instead of 50-60. It's probably going to vibrate back and forth between the two of them unless, at the current polling trends, unless we start getting a more solidified conservative presence in the Maritimes. As it is, right now we'll see a couple polls that have the Conservatives quite high in the Maritimes and a couple polls where they're low. So it kind of vibrates around. I'm not expecting that much. Really, not much else interesting is happening in the Maritimes polling-wise or data-wise. I have a bunch of suspicions that I have no data to back up that Newfoundland isn't actually this safe, and it's going to be much more competitive come an election for the Conservatives. Principally on the back of oil and natural gas, which is a really big industry in Newfoundland that the federal Liberals are destroying at great expense to Newfoundland. But I don't have any polling or data to back this up. The perennial problem with the Maritimes and forecasting them is that most pollsters just lump all of the Maritimes together as one block. So let's say it's like the most recent Ipsos poll had the Conservatives at 41, the Liberals at 39. What does this mean? Does that mean they're leading in Newfoundland by a shitload? Or does that mean they're barely leading everywhere? Or does that mean they're doing really well in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, but Newfoundland and PEI, the Liberals are doing better? It's hard to say. So there's a lot of guessing work put in there and a lot of educated... Guessing work's the wrong word. It's a lot of educated forecasting based off of trends historical trends and current things that are on the ground. That said, it's really hard to say. But I have suspicions about Newfoundland here. Moving westward, Conservatives have gained another seat in Quebec. This time, this was Trois-Rivières, flipped. Last week it was Beauport, Limoilou. I apologize to Quebecers in the audience. I don't know how to pronounce these words. My French pronunciation is terrible. Liberals gained a seat as well. I don't know where, but they gained one. Bloc lost 2. Liberals gained 1 in Ontario. Conservatives lost 1. GTA area, not much of a surprise. Conservatives picked up a seat in Manitoba. Liberals lost 1. The opposite happens in Alberta. Liberals picked up a seat. Conservatives lost 1. And Liberals picked up a seat in British Columbia, and Conservatives lost 1. Now, you might be sitting at yourself and being like, wow, there's a lot of movement this week. Why? Well, one, we actually had 4 polls this week. We had an Ipsos poll, a Main Street poll, the Ledger poll, and a Nanos poll. But more importantly, the Ipsos poll contained more structural data, gave me education polling numbers, or polling numbers based on education level and polling numbers based on finance level or household income. Obviously, I'm not currently factoring household income yet. I'm waiting for a few more polls that give me household income. Like there's going to be an Angus Reid poll probably early next month. Maybe next Tuesday or something. Monday, Tuesday is what I'm expecting. I'm expecting it because I was actually polled by Angus Reid, so I actually did answer that survey. So I'm expecting that, and that normally has Angus Reid normally publishes education and household income levels, so I'm waiting for their household incomes before I add that to the model, because the fewer data points you have in a demographic category, the more swingy it is. And that's why this week we're seeing a lot of movement, because we have the last time I had education level updates was the last Angus Reid poll at the end of August. So there's a lot of movement as a result of one poll, which is this Ipsos poll. This one Ipsos poll caused a lot of movement. That said, it only moved in areas where I figured it would move, other than Alberta. That was a surprise. But again, Alberta, Saskatchewan, I'm pretty sure the polling is off in those provinces. For the same reason, I think it's off in Newfoundland. And actually, if we even look at the Saskatchewan provincial election, the polling was off by a lot there. So, again, I'm not going to go into that now. I'll go into that later in another video. So I do have some doubts on the exact margins. But that all said, if this is, especially British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, the margins there, I have a lot of doubts about, and Newfoundland. Newfoundland, it's really hard to call either way, but even if my suspicion is right in all of these areas, I'm really only expecting it would be a seat change of maybe, best case scenario for the Conservatives, 6 between British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and maybe 1 or 2 in Newfoundland. So maybe 8 seats, which doesn't actually really affect anything. You still have Liberal NDP majority government. Doesn't really affect much. But I think that's actually more reasonable. I don't want to include, I'm not actually putting that in my prediction. That's what my expectation is. I don't think these BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, or Newfoundland numbers are realistic. We'll see. But to move on to actual raw results, here we go. So, this is this week's updates, October the 28th. So, what has happened? Well, PPC went down a tiny little bit, as to be expected. Independent vote went up. Bloc vote went down a lot. It went down 2.2, which is significant considering we're not in campaign time. I'm not really sure what's up with that. I don't really know. Maybe people in Quebec are upset that the Bloc was supporting the Conservatives on some of these uh, committee motions. I don't really know. I can't. I can't think of a mechanism for why the Bloc's going down, but it looks like it's pretty. Like if we scroll over here to these trends, that's a pretty significant downward trend now for the Bloc. Like, just eyeballing this. This is like. Let's not eyeball it. Just give me a second. That's like a 72, a correlation of 0.72. So like at that point, 6 data points in a correlation of 0.72. That's a pretty solid trend. So there's something going on. I can't quite put a mechanism to why this is happening, but it's clearly happening. Looking at other trends here, we now have a correlation of 0.62 for a liberal upward trend. So liberals are definitely gaining steam, and I think that it's pretty obvious where that's happening. The NDP are losing ground. Like this week again, the NDP lost another 0.08 in the aggregate. The Liberals went up 0.26. Yeah, 0.26. So there is definitely upward movement now for the Liberals, and the NDP downward movement. I mean, that R squared is 0.7. Like that's a huge downward movement. So it's pretty much confirmed that these two trends are happening. These three trends, the Liberal, the NDP, not the NDP, the Conservatives and the Green Party, still like the trends are getting stronger, but it's like the Conservatives still only a correlation of 0.54. So that's like that's in that fuzzy area in statistics where it's like, is this like, it seems like a too high a correlation to just be randomness, but it's also not a very high correlation. So maybe they're getting some steam. If they are, not a ton. If you actually look at this best fit equation here, it would be like 1.0185. Like that's a pretty it's a pretty small growth rate there. But we'll see. You look at intraprovincially. Intraprovincially? That's a weird way to phrase that. If you look at provinces by themselves, Conservatives and Liberals are gaining ground in Quebec at the expense of the Bloc primarily, but also a bit to the Green, the NDP. Both Liberals and Conservatives are gaining ground in Ontario. Liberals are losing ground in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, gaining a bit of ground in Alberta. Conservatives are losing a bit of ground in Alberta, but gaining the other two. BC's weird. BC, the Liberals are going up and the Conservatives are going down. I don't think that's right. I think the problem we're having here is Ipsos and Ledger, the two polls that had the Liberals doing relatively poorly in BC. I think they're just both wrong. I know strong call there, but I think those two polls are correct in BC in particular. It just, I don't know why someone who would vote Conservative in 2019 would now not be voting Conservative. It just, they're polling about like 15 and 17% or something like that. It's like, what? But why? Why did the Conservatives lose half their vote share? Or more than half their vote share? They've got like 34 in 2019. So I strongly don't, I don't think those polls are at all accurate, but they're in the model. They're not purely in the model. I'm doing some complicated stuff with the polling results, but those Ledger, even with complicated stuff that I don't really want to explain, the Ledger and Ipsos polls are still dragging on the Conservatives and pushing up the Liberals, which I don't think is quite accurate. I think if we actually saw an election, we would see the margins a lot tighter than they're being pulled at. I mean, that's what we saw, just as a spoiler, in the BC provincial election, barring mail-in ballots doing something crazy. But overall, that's where we're at this week. So we just flop back over here for a second. So things are still relatively stable. The Liberals have now, this week, do have a theoretical capacity for majority government. It is not outside of the realm of possibility that they could pick up a seat in Nova Scotia, a seat in British Columbia, a seat in Manitoba, and a seat in British Columbia. That would give them a majority. This is not outside the realm of possibility. Last week it was unlikely that they could do it, but this week it's now possible. It's plausible that a Liberal majority government could be on the horizon if an election happened. That said, there is two wild cards there. One, are the polls to be believed because of these by-elections and these provincial elections? Like, how accurate is the polling in Western Canada? And do these by-elections suggest a big enthusiasm gap? Are Liberals just not going to go vote? And then the other wrinkle of the matter is, will Liberal voters, which previously polled by Ledger and some other companies, Liberal voters have the least desire to have an election right now, if that makes sense. So everyone who wants an election, Liberals have the fewest people who want an election right now. So Trudeau calling an election could actually cause his own base to get mad at him and not vote for him, which is obviously a disaster for him if his own base gets mad and does not vote for him. So I'm actually not expecting, even though the map looks good for the Liberals by my model right now, I'm not expecting it. I'm not expecting a snap election. Maybe Trudeau will continue doing some brinkmanship and essentially play chicken with the opposition and with confidence votes. I can see that happening. But barring polling getting better for him, and when I say better, I mean like solid majority. Like if he's like, you see my model here, it has him at like 166. If Trudeau can be sitting here in my model, not at 166, but at like 180 or like 174, so like solidly in the majority territory, I think maybe he gambles the snap election. But getting the 180 range, that'd be very difficult. So let's say they take Fredericton and West Nova. They take, would be ambitious, 3 seats in British Columbia. That's 5. 2 in Manitoba, maybe? That's 7. Maybe take 2 in Alberta, 1 in Saskatchewan. That's 10. That's only 166. I don't really see many ridings that the Conservatives are holding in Ontario flipping back Liberal. So it would be difficult. They would need to flip 4 ridings in Ontario or flip ridings from block. Flipping them from block is not impossible. I don't see them flipping 4. Likewise, I don't see 4 ridings in Ontario flipping over. And if I'm Trudeau, I don't think I feel comfortable going into an election without a very clear margin. If you look at if you look at New Brunswick and you look at BC, they called the snap elections there. To be fair, New Brunswick wasn't quite a snap election, but those elections happened there, were allowed to happen by the premiers because they had comfortable polling margins. They were up like plus 10. And if we just flip back over here for a second, you can see, even though Trudeau's numbers are going up, he's only up 2.6. That's within margin of error. Like, that's as close as it's going to be, really. So, especially when you consider, mind you, my model already corrects this, so it's not just the raw polling. So I would actually stand to believe that this is probably what an election would actually stand like. I don't think there'd be any more correction to this on the national numbers. Possibly some fiddling with some provincial numbers. But it would be very... It would require big polling misses for the Liberals to pull out a strong majority with this margins. But that all said, if you liked the video, please like, share, subscribe. Comment below if you have any thoughts on the current state of affairs in Canada, on Wee scandal, on these two provincial elections, or whether these by-elections, how they should be interpreted. Are they warnings on actual popular support in Ontario, or is it just a premonition of voter enthusiasm? Are liberal voters just not enthusiastic to go out and vote for Trudeau anymore? Feel free to I greatly encourage the discussion. I would love to talk with anyone in the comments below about it. Otherwise, hope you all have a good day, and see you next week.